Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat, coming to you from Tokyo Bay for the second edition of Taiwan Talks on tour in Japan. Now behind me is Yokosuka. It is the US's biggest overseas Navy base, considered one of the most strategically important to the US military. It's also the home to the 7th Fleet, America's largest forward deployed Navy fleet, which covers an area stretching from the India-Pakistan border in the west to Japan's Kuril Islands in the east. It's also got responsibility for the world's 5 next largest militaries: China, Russia, India, and North and South Korea. Now, to discuss this and the challenges facing Japan, we had the great privilege to sit down with former Vice-Admiral Koda Yoji. Earlier, take a look. We now have the great privilege to speak with former Vice-Admiral Koda Yoji, Japan's Self-Defense Fleet former Commander-in-Chief, who also served as a senior fellow at Harvard University after retiring from Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force. Vice-Admiral, it's a huge honor to welcome you to the show today.
Oh, it's my honor too, so yeah.
So after a 6-month gap without a US carrier in the Western Pacific, we now have 3. 7th Fleet's permanently deployed carrier, the George Washington, also Abraham Lincoln and the Carl Vinson. And that is so that they are there for the transition between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Now, do you share the concerns with the US about China being the biggest threat to political stability in the next 50 days?
It's natural for the United States to prepare for everything, especially for the worst case scenario. China, especially Beijing, is keeping a kind of the calm observation. So China really takes or calculates the US intent, but China also, at this moment, thinks this is not the real military provocation or coercion against Beijing.
And you said, obviously, the US has to prepare for any eventuality. What, though, do you expect China could do? Do you expect China to be trying to test the new administration?
Yes, but especially in this case, China already had an experience, 4 years experience of the first term. China is, the calculating the Trump administration will maintain a kind of the same type of harder policy toward China, both in economy and diplomacy, and also the security military. So China is preparing for everything, but also some kind of the unpredictability of the President Trump had to help us, or makes the equation a little complicated for the Beijing to make the future planning.
Right. And because if we can talk about the locations of these carriers, obviously George Washington based at Yokosuka, Tokyo Bay, the Abraham Lincoln, I understand, is moving from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, obviously a hot spot, and the Carl Vinson in the Pacific, I guess, to the east of Taiwan. Do you expect that China would try to have some sort of forceful test, or do you actually believe that they want stability because they are bracing for a Trump presidency?
Key thing is U.S. long-term security strategy and the force deployment, the principle do not change. The USA is also telling the Beijing, we do not forget the South China Sea or East China Sea or the Northwestern Pacific around Taiwan. So US is sending the right signal. And one of the current answers available for the US to Beijing is, now look at this. We will be, at least in the peacetime, surge 3 carriers in this region. So I think that the Beijing has right understanding, and I don't think Beijing would not count the U.S. interest is weakening. So I think U.S. is doing the right business.
But can I ask you then whether you think the first incursion into Japanese sovereign airspace, and that was on August 26th, and also the first carrier to go through Japanese contiguous waters, these are all in the southwest islands. Would that have happened if there had been a US carrier there?
And you know, of course, in the broader sense, the U.S. and Japan is under alliance. But if we take a close focus, look at the Chinese, the electoral electronic surveillance aircraft invasion into our airspace, or the carrier's passage. I think China is testing Japanese response. That's correct. And my opinion, Japanese government response is very weak. Too bad. But
What did you expect them to do?
yeah, they say kind of the diplomatic condemnation to the Beijing, and would Beijing change by that? The diplomatic condemnation? No. So
you expected a military show of force?
Or at least larger scale exercise in the South China Sea, Air Force exercise, and also the East China Sea. So that is the kind of the Japanese options, much harder options, But especially Japanese political priority toward China is, the much, I would say, the well calculated. That means keeping the calm situation. And carrier's passage is, I'd say China also tested Japan, but at the same time, that is fully under the UNCLOS, because the contiguous water is the part of the high sea, and of course the coastal nation has the special rights in that area, but the military ships are out of that, the regulation. So in that context, we have nothing to say, but
it wasn't illegal.
No, illegal. But at the same time, do we have option? Yes, we have. We can do the same thing back to the China, but that's one thing Japanese government do not want to take.
Right.
So
you think that a show of force is really the only language that China understands?
Right. So in that sense, China is testing the Japanese government or the Japanese policy. Would there be any changes or future potential changes? And Beijing's current, the understanding is there would be no change in the Japanese policy toward China. So, but if we keep on that one, China gradually escalate, their maneuvers, military maneuvers around Japan. So, and there are many other things, happening, especially at sea. So, it's about right time for Japanese government to reset the Japanese, I would say, military responses toward Chinese. The looks benign and soft, but pretty well calculated, the challenges against Japanese sovereignty. If that happens in next 100 years, are we keeping on saying, no, we don't agree that this is our Japanese territory, please don't do that? Is that the only response to China for next 100 years? That's not the right thing for us to do. And Japan also, as a sovereign nation, we have the many rights to do. Far before the going for the use of the military, it's a military conflict. So peacetime use of the military is really the one of the sovereign rights for any the sovereign nations. So
let's talk about the buildup of China's navy over the time since the time you were in command of the self-defense fleet, 2007, 2008. Let me give you an example, because the USS George Washington has returned, upgraded. It can now carry and operate F-35 stealth fighters, is bringing the F-35 squadron with it this time. And at the Zhuhai Air Show, China also announced that its J-35s will be used on all its carriers. So can you help us to understand the change in China's Navy from 2007 to today, the scale and the speed?
I would say our Japanese honest observation of a Chinese military. Sometime around 2005, Chinese and the naval forces are still, I'd say, less capable than Japanese Navy. That's what we thought. But but China also at the same time behind that, the China started the very aggressive naval buildup sometime around mid 1990s. So now the sometime after 2005 to 2010 period, Chinese Navy started get the jump increase of the size of the force, and also the quality of the equipment they operate. So yes, they are getting the more and more capable the naval forces. That's correct, but at the same time say why for the U.S. Navy the US to really become the carrier navy we call it took the real start of the U.S. Navy carrier was 1920. Really raising and developing the real capable naval aviation. It took almost 100 years, and especially very bitter experience in the World War II against Japan. That was the I'd say the point of departure for the U.S. The key thing is China is not they say 10 meters high giant. They have they look stronger, but there are so many the problematic areas, and also the U.S. new carrier, the Gerald Ford. Ford, the construction of Ford completed 8 years ago, but first 7 years, Ford was not operationally capable because so many problems of the new equipment. So I'm not saying to the Taiwanese people, okay, you are safe. Please, they sleep safely tonight. No. But at the same time, I'd say excessive fear over the Chinese, the military capabilities again. And one other thing is US and Japan and Australia and South Korea are in this region. Okay. Now China really Mr. Xi Jinping's mistake is woke those four nations up, and we're now coming together, right? You know, our advantage, and also using the geography. The Taiwan, Okinawa, Kyushu Island chain is a kind of the big dam for the Chinese, the forces.
And it's part of the first island chain,
Yeah,
obviously.
right. What they call that, that's the first island chain of ours, not theirs. Okay, but anyway, if we will be able to appropriate, align our strategy and the operational concept, that would be a clear deterring signal to Beijing. So that's another thing we need to discuss.
You've talked about, that if China attacks Taiwan, that it will also open the door for Beijing to take the Senkaku Islands, also known as Daoyutai, which China claims as part of Taiwan, which it also claims and says that Taiwan has been part of China, quote, for since ancient times. How would you characterize Taiwan's fate then with that of Japan's? Is it, as Shinzo Abe has said, an attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan?
I think in this argument there are so many the ingredients into one pot. For example, strategic importance of Taiwan and Senkaku is the same? No. Okay. Any military conflict happens in Taiwan is Japan's issue. That's correct. But it's a kind of very general, comprehensive argument. And some may say China would only attack Taiwan and they would not take Japanese Western Island. Yes, that is option. But if that happens under the treaty, U.S. is free to use those Western Islands to make the side attack against Chinese invasion force. So Beijing, I don't think they would
But they would
not be
hold
happy
back.
to take that, the option.
Right.
So, but anyway, the responsibility of the government is to prepare for the worst. So that means, that Beijing, and also it's natural, or kind of the common sense, especially for the military planners, that when China make any military maneuvers over Taiwan, the, of course, the seizure of the western island of Japan is part of the Taiwan operations.
And you've warned before, since essentially, well, at least in your time as commander of the self-defense fleet, you've warned that Japan isn't prepared for a Taiwan
Right.
crisis, well before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I do want to ask you what your view is about that risk. How more likely is China to make that attack, given that Russia's invasion of Ukraine seems to be, yielding it possible territory if Trump comes in, forces Ukraine to the negotiating table?
There are so many unknowns, but Taiwan is very different, Uh, of course, China says that the Taiwan is the kind of the God-given territory of the China, but of course, America and Japan understand China's position, but we do not agree with the Chinese position. Say if any military maneuver that is against Chinese Taiwanese people's, the intent. If the Taiwanese people want the freedom, free society, or more autonomous, the political posture, there are common value. There is common value of the democracy and free society. So the response with the U.S. will be fairly different from the Ukraine.
Can I ask you about
Yeah.
Trump's influence? So those close to the U.S., next U.S. president, previously had spoken about the need for Japan to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP. Of course, now Japan is in the middle of doubling its current spending from 1% to 2%. Now, given you have criticized the process of that doubling of the defense spending, not the increase itself, but the process, can I get your thoughts on Japan being forcibly asked to increase to 5%? What sort of pressures would that put on Japan?
Yeah, the security planning and the alliances, the operational side, we take very closely the alliance nature into account, but also force buildup or defense spending, including the money goes for the U.S. That's our matter. So when we think it's necessary, we will increase. And single fact is, the before 2015 Abe period, Japanese government people did not want to pay more than 1%. But now, say Shinzo Abe, 2012, I think Shinzo Abe took his, the second term office. The rise of China really changed the situation, so he decided. And then Kishida also decided to increase the budget to currently, I think, 1.7%. And that's not, forced by US.
And that was from Japan itself
Yeah,
through the
we
three
think it's
strategies.
necessary.
Yeah.
Okay, and Japanese people support it. And so in the future, and Kishida said 2%, about the same level of the NATO. But when we really think it's necessary and Chinese military expansion is too rapid, and we think it's more, maybe we will go to 3%. Oh, of course, no one in the government mentioned that, but this is how it works. And in order to do so, there are so many coordinations. Okay, what do you need? And especially, the Taiwan operations. Where will be the operation base for Taiwan for the U.S. forces? Japan. One precedent or example is the 1990 Saddam Hussein's Kuwait invasion. What made it that possible? Saudi Arabia. You know, 2,000 fighters, 2,000 transport and air refueling tankers, and the several hundreds of and then mainly the NATO station U.S. forces first came to the Saudi Arabia, and they prepare and they doing exercise, and also they piled up the fuel and ammunition, and then against Saddam Hussein's invasion force. And in case of Taiwan, that's U.S. is the other side of the Pacific, and Hawaii is still too far, and Guam is too small. Who'd help the U.S. forces operations? Okay. In case of real Taiwan contingency, so U.S. would send about the same size of the 1990 the Kuwait invasion. So huge forces would come. Who'd support that? What nation? Capable nation? Only Japan. So Japan has much larger responsibility, and that's the point, Mr. Trump. Unfortunately, I don't think he understands. So the Japanese leadership, especially Ishida, Prime Minister Ishida, or Foreign Minister and Defense Ministry, they made the best effort to convince. I don't know if Mr. Trump really listened to our, the stories, but we need to make it happen. Okay, if Japan's capability to support U.S. forces would lose. Magnificent, robust U.S. forces, lack of the operational support, including the logistic, U.S. forces would fail. That's the last thing we want. So the Japan has a lot to do, but so Mr. Trump may say many things, but again, especially in the policy side, politicians, political leaders, especially a person like Trump may say many hard things by voice, but his real policy could be a little, I would say, neutralized. And that's what happened exactly in the 4 years period of the 17 to 21. Was any country died? No. Under the Trump administration, yes, a lot of economic problems, but they barely managed. But this time we have to be much more serious. But key is U.S.-Japan communication, focusing on the Taiwan situation. Okay, so that would be the key. And please, we should not make Mr. Xi Jinping happy.
Yeah. And on that theme, you've spoken before about the concept of strengthening the glue of the US-Japan alliance. So what I'm hearing from you is, it's not just Japan that needs to do this. Obviously, it's the US. There's some commentator, Seth Rogen, has recommended that the US increase its own spending on defense from 3% to 6% of GDP, which was what they were spending in the Reagan years during the Cold War. Now, obviously, everybody can recognize that China is a more formidable opponent than the USSR. What's your view on that?
Yeah, we have to be clever and wise enough. Yeah, and exactly, I was the first planner in the Reagan days, so I know that. Right. But China today, without sea lines of communication to anywhere in the world, they would die. So we have some different natures. So some American thinkers may say 6%, like the Reagan days, but again, Chinese new nature, that really helps Chinese economic growth, but at the same time, that will be the Achilles heel for China in wartime. Or again, I repeat, but God-given nature of the geography, China is fully blocked already. Okay? Japanese island chain, Taiwan, Philippines, to the Malay Peninsula, and Chinese Navy is getting out. Yeah, but in principle, who controls the Pacific and Indian Ocean? Us. So simply comparing the amount of spending relative to GDP is important, but sometimes there are many other things. And especially today, again, China is not 10-meter tall, high giant.
Although that's the impression it wants to create.
Yeah. So, and there are many, the Chinese problematic areas, and that makes us more advantageous. And so that is the area or types of elements both US and Japan need to discuss and align a strategy, including the Australia and the Canada, perhaps. Canada and Australia and the Korea. So if we wisely develop those kind of the orchestrated, well-aligned strategy toward China, we'll be okay. But key is, really the political effort and the wise alignment of the strategy, and also how to convince the President Trump. Okay, role of Japan will be very important, far important than ordinary people think. Again, okay, the role of Saudi Arabia in the 1990s. Without that, U.S. mighty, magnificent forces in this region would not function. That is the last thing we want. So that's the area we need to focus on.
Okay. On that hopeful note, we have to end the show. Thank you so much for your time today, Koda Yoji.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.